So if you had questions after this weekend's military operation to be able to go and arrest Nicolas Maduro and his wife in Venezuela, I hope you understand that you were in good company, because members of Congress, including Republicans, they were not notified prior to this weekend's operations. And I've got Congressman Jim Himes, who is a member of the Gang of Eight. And you would think that he would have been notified, but no, because that's exactly what the Trump administration does. It operates in secrecy, and then it basically says, I'm going to ask for forgiveness later, but it's not even doing that now. I had Congressman Himes join me to answer questions about Venezuela, Greenland, seized Russian oil tankers, as well as, importantly, the Affordable Care Act and the extension of those tax credits. Listen to what he had to say. And joining me now is Congressman Jim Himes from the great state of Connecticut, also the House Permanent Select Committee Intelligence Ranking Member. I mean, Congressman Himes, on January 3rd, you issued what I thought was a pretty fitting statement that there was no evidence that Maduro's presidency posed a threat that would justify military action without congressional authorization, nor have you heard at that time on January 3rd a strategy for the day after and how we prevent Venezuela from descending into chaos. Secretary Rubio repeatedly denied to Congress that the administration intended to force a regime change in Venezuela. The administration must immediately brief Congress on its plans to ensure stability in the region and its legal justification for this decision. Since January 3rd, have you been briefed? And of course, respecting classified information, what can you share that has been provided with you thus far?
Yeah. So, yes, since I issued that statement, and, I should tell you where that statement came from. My wife literally woke me up on Sunday morning early and said, hey, I think you might want to be awake for this. So it wasn't even the media that told the ranking member of the Intelligence Committee that this had gone down. It was my wife early on Sunday morning. So, now, since then, to answer your question, yes, we've had one Gang of Eight briefing, which I participated in, and then I just came out of a all members briefing. It was really kind of a carbon copy of the Gang of Eight meeting of 48 hours ago. And look, it's we kind of still are where we were when we learned of the raid. You can't hear this story as we just heard it. I've now heard it twice without just being astonished by the capability of our military, point granted. And, we should all admit that Maduro was a very, very bad guy.
Concede, yes.
But
Concede
we've seen this
points.
movie before, right? We took out the Taliban in 2002 in Afghanistan. We took out Saddam Hussein. Again, the military doing exactly what they're designed to do. We helped take out Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Think about those three countries, right? Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq. So the question is not so much is our military good? The question is what happens in the days, weeks, and months to come, because that's where history says you're going to have some real problems. Now, there's another issue too, right? Which is, as a member of Congress and as somebody who can actually read the Constitution of the United States, the Congress, the representatives of the American people, are supposed to take the lead or at least be involved in the decision to take a military action. Now, look, Marco Rubio is saying this was a law enforcement action. We were supporting the FBI and the arrest. We had more military involved in this raid. I'm not going to start making military analogies, but we, this used a very significant chunk of American combat power to effect.
So I heard that Senate Leader John Thune said and defended the Trump administration's decision not to brief the Gang of Eight prior to this mission taking place or these operations taking place. How does that sit with you? The idea that a colleague in Congress thinks that you and the Gang of Eight are not trustworthy enough to be able to receive critical information like this in advance?
Well, first of all, we are, right? As far as I know, there's never been a leak from the Gang of Eight. As far as I know, there's never been a member prosecuted for leaking classified information. I don't know. I'd have to think hard about it, but I don't think a member has ever been prosecuted. There's lots of leaking, and leaking is never okay, but there's precisely zero evidence that that's the Congress. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you think that we're leaky, even though we're not, because the law says, and not just the law, but the Constitution says, you involve Congress in these decisions. You get permission from the Congress. And it doesn't say unless you wake up one morning and think this Congress is leaky, or unless you wake up one morning and you decide that you don't want to actually have to, present your battle plans to somebody who is less loyalty obsessed than Pete Hegseth, right? The law is the law. And, again, I think there's two things that we need to be focused on going forward. Number one is, where does this go?
Yeah.
And
where does this go? Is there a plan or concepts of a plan?
There's not even concepts of a plan. I was just chuckling with a reporter because one of my colleagues said there's concepts. No, there's not concepts of a plan. Look, remember what happened here, right? We used an immense amount of military hardware, more military hardware, frankly, than I think any other country has. I mean, there were ships and planes and helicopters and you name it, to remove one guy. We did not do a regime change here. The bad guys, the corrupt drug runners, the guys who were, furnishing Swiss chalets with illegally gotten oil money, they're all still in power and they still have guns. And it is my hope that this administration doesn't believe that, young men and women in the American Armed Forces ought to take on those guys with guns. Because back to your original question, Venezuela is a bad place. The leadership of Venezuela is a bad leadership. The regime is awful. But at no point in time was Venezuela or the cocaine coming out of Venezuela, as awful as it was and as awful as the drug problem is, at no point in time was Venezuela ever a tier 1 American security threat on the order of Iran or anyway, bottom line here is we now know what this was about. Don't take it from Jim Himes, take it from Donald Trump, who in his press release used the word oil 20 times. And in fact, in today's briefing, Marco Rubio spent a lot of time talking about how we're going to get the oil. So let's just be really clear about what this was about. We know it wasn't about drugs because the president pardoned a much bigger drug kingpin, the former president of Honduras, than Maduro ever aspired to be. So now we're talking about some huge risks being taken to get a bunch of oil.
Well, yeah. And today, the Trump administration, through its Secretary of Energy, is meeting with all of the big oil execs from ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, and Chevron here in Miami, Florida. And they're plotting out how they're going to be dealing with the rebuilding of the infrastructure for the oil in Venezuela. I do want to spend a minute, though, with you, Congressman, pulling on this thread about regime change, right? Because you made it clear, and others have made it clear in Congress, that Secretary Rubio reassured everybody this was not about a regime change. This would not be about a regime change. And to your well-taken point about that, Diosdado Cabello Rondon has a $25 million reward from the State Department. He's the Minister of Interior, Justice, and Peace. He's still in place in Venezuela. Vladimir Padrino Lopez with a $15 million reward, general and head of the Venezuelan Armed Forces in place. And Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president to Nicolas Maduro, she is now the acting interim leader / president, whatever you want to call her, of Venezuela. And so all of the bad stuff that was being perpetrated in the Maduro regime pretty much remains. You just don't have the name Maduro to head it up. So how are there any safeguards that the American military or our American forces are not going to be obligated to have to continue to participate if we are, quote, running this country now remotely?
Yeah. And I mean, make no mistake, we're not running the country. A lot of this stuff is just things that the president says because he hopes that it comes true. It's like, him ending the Ukraine-Russia war on day one of his presidency. He just commits to things that are not true and probably aren't ever going to be true, right? So of course we're not running Venezuela right now. What they're hoping is that, and this is the strategy, and I guess this is a strategy of sorts, but what they're hoping is all those people you just named watched what happened to Maduro and his wife. And so when Marco Rubio calls them up and says, you're going to send us these 5 tankers full of oil, dock them in Miami, we're going to unload it, and we're going to send you $10 billion so you can pay your postal employees and your police, he's hoping that they will say yes. And look, maybe for some period of time that will work. I mean, there's sort of a word for that. That word is extortion, of course, or protection. I don't know what you want to call it. But the
very
point is
mob-like. Very mob-like.
Yeah, exactly. But, I mean, and that's assuming, by the way, that when the new president, Delcy Rodriguez, says, I'm going to cooperate with the Secretary of State, that the Cuban security guy standing next to her with a 9mm Glock doesn't put that gun against her forehead and pull the trigger, right? I mean, this is a complicated thing.
Congressman, within 30 days of the presidency being permanently vacated, the Venezuelan constitution requires that elections be had. I have not heard anybody use the word elections, either from our administration or even from Delcy Rodriguez, for example. So for all intents and purposes, then, the United States is going to be looking at a regime that continues, that's still composed of 99% of what the Maduro regime was prior to him being arrested.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, it opens the door to the weird possibility that, the American administration may oppose elections in the next 30 days, right? Why? Because if you call elections 3 weeks from now, I can tell you who's going to win, right? The opposition in Venezuela is divided. Many of its leaders are outside of the country. Mrs. Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, I don't know where she is, but I do know that the president of the United States completely cut the ground out from under her in that press conference that he gave. So, I'm just guessing here, but I'm thinking that the United States is not going to want the old regime to say, okay, we're doing elections again, because they'll of course just keep power.
So we have to obviously talk about Greenland. How can we not? It's kind of outrageous. Mike Johnson saying, I think, the mature thing by we're not going to take Greenland by power. Now, by force. Marco Rubio now saying we're interested in buying Greenland, which technically I think is different than taking it by force. But how seriously are you listening to the commentary about Trump, Greenland, frankly, Trump, Panama, Trump, Cuba? I mean, I could keep on going.
Yeah. Look, I'm developing a healthy humility about my ability to predict Donald Trump, because frankly, I took Marco Rubio at his word when he told the Congress that there was no plan to try to affect regime change or to do this sort of invasion on Venezuela. So I've got a whole new humility about my ability to predict these things. What I can tell you is that there is a huge difference in reality and in the minds of MAGA and Republicans, and a lot of my Republican colleagues here, most of whom wake up every morning, trying to figure out how they can, show their loyalty to Donald Trump. There's a huge difference between taking out a murderous, illegitimate drug dealing president of Venezuela and attacking a NATO ally. I mean, those things aren't even closely related. So like, the rational thinker in me says, oh, well, Donald Trump will be a little bit more careful about contemplating that kind of thing than he would. But, it turns out I'm usually pretty wrong when I think that Donald Trump will be a little bit more careful about anything. So, look, if that happens, the Republican Party will split brutally. That will cause a lot of Republicans to say, I'm no longer with this guy. Because, they still have that old Reaganite anti-Russian instinct. They just are very, very, very quiet about expressing it. And secondly, oh my God. I mean, we shouldn't even be contemplating this. We need our NATO allies, right? Yes, on our own, we can go and take one guy out of Caracas, but to stand against the Chinese and the Russians, we need our allies.
But Trump doesn't want us to be in NATO, right? I mean, he does, at a minimum, he thinks that the other members are not carrying their financial load, but he's made it pretty clear that he thinks it's a worthless organization. So in some ways, this actually, the critical kind of destruction of NATO, at least in the United States involvement, it would actually satisfy an itch, I think, that Trump has had.
Yeah. And I think you're right about that. He doesn't like NATO. And the reason I think he doesn't like NATO is not for ideological reasons. Trump has no ideology, right? Sure. If you look at Venezuela, if you look at the way he thinks about all this stuff, the fact that he, can't say enough good stuff about Vladimir Putin, that he respects dictators in North Korea, he respects power and strength. And he doesn't see Belgium and Spain and Italy and France in that category, or he wants the deal. He wants the oil. Right now, unless the British are going to hand over the oil from the North Sea, or the Italians are going to hand over the tomato business, the French are going to hand over Christian Dior, Donald Trump is never going to see Europe as anything other than no business opportunity there, and there are a bunch of weaklings that we carry the water for. And so it's not that he hates NATO. It's just he doesn't see the grift-like opportunities that, look, what do we know he's really excited about? Yeah, he enjoyed bombing the Iranians. Everybody loves when our weapons do amazing things. But you can just tell he loves Venezuela because he's getting oil. I mean?
It's absurd. But, look, Russia and China have had pronounced interest, specifically dealing with the oil in Venezuela. We just seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker under the auspices of this idea of Venezuelan sanctions. Russia's going to respond one way or another. We've been trying to deal with this delicate balance of figuring out if the Russian-Ukrainian war could be ended. We also know, frankly, what interest Trump also has in rare minerals, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot that's moving here, all of which kind of puts us on the back of our heels, despite Trump trying to say otherwise, that this is some sign of strength by doing these acts.
Well, let me respond in a way that may not make you happy, but the tanker that was just seized was not a Russian flag vessel. It was a ghost. It was a sanctioned ghost fleet vessel. At the very last minute, they put a Russian flag up, but it was not a Russian flag vessel.
Well, then, breaking news, it was not a Russian flagged vessel. There we go.
It was not a Russian flag vessel. Now, here's the thing, and here's why I feel strongly about this. We need to maintain the credibility around opposing the administration when they do clearly illegal things, like, snatching a leader of another country without consulting with Congress. I actually think that enforcing the sanctions on the ghost trade in oil that is funding the Iranians, that is funding the Russians, that is killing Ukrainians, I draw a distinction there. So especially when you consider that the Russians respect only strength. So I actually think the seizure of these vessels is sending a message to the Kremlin, which the president is unwilling to send directly, but which is, there is a line and don't screw around, because you know what? You can't even take Ukraine after 4 years. We had Caracas for about 10 minutes, in no time at all. So I do draw a distinction between those two things.
But are you imputing that to Trump, that level of, I guess, chess when it comes to strategic geopolitical moves? I mean, that sounds to me great and it makes sense, but is the sanctions on Venezuela necessarily a function of trying to send that message to Vladimir Putin?
Oh, yeah. No, of course not. No, I'm just saying, how are the Russians going to think about this and how should I think about it? I don't think the seizure of sanctioned vessels is illegal. In fact, I think it's actually wise, because there's a massive trade in illegal oil that we ought to work to stop. So, no. Do I think that Trump thinking, leaning back and saying, yeah, well, Vladimir Putin will see our military. Of course not. He wants the oil, so, but anyway, I do draw a distinction between what they did with Maduro and the seizure of sanctioned vessels, which I'm actually generally supportive of.
So the one thing that, and you and I talked about this before we hit the record button here, the one thing that's really not being talked about is the fact that there is an imminent vote on the tax subsidies credits extension for 3 years. That was a discharge petition that everybody signed on for the Democrats and some Republicans prior to the holiday break that Johnson refused to make sure had any action taken prior to the holiday break. What are the chances of the Senate taking this up?
Really good question. And I'm so glad you asked it because, I'm sort of a little schizophrenic on this Venezuela stuff.
Sure.
What I should always say first for the benefit of your watchers and listeners or the American people is whatever you think of Venezuela, you know what it's not doing? It's not making your healthcare more available or chicken cheaper or electricity cheaper. In fact, it's probably going to make it more expensive and raise your taxes. So thank you for asking the question. And I will point out that we are actually going to have a vote in the next 48 hours here in the House to extend for 3 years the Affordable Care Act subsidies that would provide, huge relief to millions and millions of Americans. And it's courtesy of the Democratic Party in the House, which used a weird parliamentary maneuver, a discharge petition, and a few, I think 3 or 4 courageous Republicans. We're going to get a vote. And you know what? I can't fully answer your question, Katie, on the Senate, but given the fact that the president yesterday told Republicans to be flexible on healthcare because he realizes he's about to get shellacked on the issue, I think there's going to be, after we pass that bill, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Senate to do something.
Well, I also find the distractions is the game for this administration, but there is a budget showdown that's going to be coming up at the end of this month that I've been harping on for months, which was part of my reason that I was disappointed in what I call a capitulation by some of the Senate Dems to be able to end the government shutdown last year, which is we're going to be facing yet another government shutdown in a few weeks. At the end of January, we're going to be dealing with whether or not we have to do another continuing resolution or if we'd actually get the remaining 9 long-term bills passed. We only got 3 passed before, and thank God for SNAP, et cetera. But your thoughts about this is a very short runway. It's January 7th. Between now and the end of January to be able to hammer out a budget that's going to work.
Very short runway, and I agree with everything you just said. But I want to tell you a story. I happened to be in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, about 5 weeks ago for the election, and I got a chance to sit down with some Connecticut National Guardsmen who were guarding an air base that we have there, and I had breakfast with them. And to a person, these were all 19, 20, 22-year-olds, with families back in Hartford and Bridgeport. To a person, they said, when the government was shut down, they were as respectful and as kind and as wonderful as to a person. They said, when the government was shut down, my wife and children were standing in line at the food banks. And, as a consequence of hearing that story, I don't want to talk about shutdowns in terms of who won and who lost, because it hurts a lot of really, really good people. And, we need to avoid that at all costs.
Well, I appreciate that sentiment of getting us back to the realities, which is all and everything that happens impacts us as people. And regardless of party affiliation, our electeds should be doing their best to make our lives better. That's why you and others are elected to office. I just share a concern, though, that I know you have and other Democrats have, which is everything costs a lot of money. It's always been pricey, but things including like basic necessities like healthcare have now skyrocketed, either doubled or tripled at this point. And so have you heard or have you felt like there's a little bit more movement from your Republican colleagues across the aisle to have that empathy for their constituents?
No way. In fact, as we speak, the president is scaling back nutritional aid and other programs to states that he doesn't like, Colorado and stuff.
Yep.
So no, it's just not there. And look, that explains why you saw the elections turn out the way they did last November. Americans, sure, they care about Venezuelans and dictators and lots of stuff. But when a guy becomes president because he says Biden's inflation is the reason that you're not going on vacation this year, the American people feel that in their, in their guts. And, what have we done in the last year? A crazy invasion of Venezuela, tariffs that have made the situation worse. And so, it's going to dawn, and it has. It's going to dawn on Republicans around here that however you want to think about the empathy issue, you are about to get shellacked. What's my proof point? Yesterday, Donald Trump, talking to the Republican conference, said, guys, get a healthcare deal done. Be flexible on the Hyde Amendment. Now,
right.
let's make sure people understand what the Hyde Amendment is. The Hyde Amendment is a long-standing Republican-driven proposition that says that no public money can be used for abortions, right? Now, this is catechism for the Republicans, and Donald Trump told the Republicans, be flexible on it. It freaked them out. Their heads exploded. But anyway, I tell you that story because Donald Trump, who, whatever else you think of him, has pretty good sensitive political antenna, he's realizing how horribly shellacked he and his party are about to get.
Really quickly, because I know I have to let you go, I wanted to circle back to Venezuela for just a second. I have seen the required war powers memo that was issued. It's dated January 5th. Pursuant to the War Powers Resolution, it's required to be provided to Congress, even though no congressional authorization was obviously obtained prior to that mission or the operation in Venezuela. It is thin. I mean, anybody could pull it. Anybody could read it. It's really short. What recourse do you and others have to get more information to satisfy the remaining questions that are unanswered for not only yourselves, but the American public?
Because you don't live where I live, your standards are higher, right? Like I was expecting a piece of paper on the legally required notification, which was like a line. Hey, we did a thing in Venezuela, Congress.
There's a little bit of stuff. There's a little bit.
A few paragraphs there. So what I'll tell you is that, in fact, I'm walking out of this, to go sit in a meeting. We're going to put together, a Venezuela war powers resolution, which is going to say, unless you get approval from the Congress, obviously we can't go back and turn back history on what happened 3 days ago, but any further military action is not going to happen unless we get approval. And I'm hoping, remember, we won 2 Republicans, on a war powers resolution, similar one a couple of weeks ago. So I'm hoping we may actually constrain the president's ability to do this again without coming to us, but we'll see.
Well, Congressman Jim Himes, I always appreciate the candor, the willingness to be flexible, and to also give this information. Our viewers are desperate and hungry to know what is happening, and we obviously don't get it at the level that you're able to give. And so I appreciate your time, and thanks for being such a great advocate for the truth.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
It's good to see you. Katie Phang here. We launched the Katie Phang News Channel in partnership with the Midas Touch Network so we could bring you the latest in legal and political news. Straight, no chaser. So if you're a fellow truth teller, hit that subscribe button and share the word about this channel so we can build a high information America together.